Today's speaker is Tom Bullock. Tom is a consultant clinical scientist with NHS Blood and Transplant, and Tom works out of the red cell immunohaematology lab in Filton. Tom's a brilliant speaker and educator. I've been lucky enough to work with Tom and see him speak virtually and in person. Always really informative, sometimes funny, sometimes otherwise. But I'm sure this is going to be a fantastic and informative talk. So I'm now going to hand over to Tom to get the meeting started. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Danny and Selma and Nasir for inviting me to speak today on the subject of blood that is rare, who, what, and where. Okay. So as Danny said, my name's Tom and I'm a scientist and I work in Bristol in red cell immunohaematology. So I specialise in antibodies to red blood cell antigens. Okay. So let's start with the who. Okay. Well, who needs rare blood? Well, there's not really a predictable type of person, I would say, who needs rare blood. It's really difficult to define. It could be anyone. It could be you. It could be me. It could be a relative. It could be anyone. We really don't know until these people present at hospital. And in RCI, we're always finding people, in different cohorts of patients who need blood that is slightly more unusual than the normal red cell phenotypes that we stock as routine in either our hospital blood banks or in the NHS BT stocks. And these patients can fit any kind of demographic. We're regularly finding patients or regularly finding blood for patients just for planned operations. People are having children, antenatal and obstetric patients, people with malignancy, and also people with hemoglobinopathies. And as I said, any of those cohorts could include any one of us, and we wouldn't be aware that we needed rare blood until we develop a condition or be treated at that point in hospital and where we may need a transfusion. So what are some of the things that makes patients difficult to transfuse? Well, primarily it's the presence of an antibody or alloimmunization. So somebody having an antibody to a blood group antigen. Now, they can have one antibody or they could have lots of different antibodies, like a mixture of antibodies that can then make blood provision a challenge and can make things quite difficult from a transfusion perspective. Now, antibodies, as we know, are normally stimulated through past transfusion or pregnancy or transplant, but there are some naturally occurring antibodies as well that can cause problems for transfusion. But the majority that we'll talk about today are stimulated through past transfusion or pregnancy. So not only, you might not only have an antibody that's difficult, an antibody that makes it hard to find blood for you, or a combination of antibodies that makes it hard to find blood for you, but that combined with how often you require that blood, how much blood you require, what type of blood you require. So do you need like pediatric specification blood? Do you need it to be HBS negative? Do you need it to be under a certain day time expiry limit? All of that can put pressure on, in addition to the urgency, how we supply blood and the type of blood that we supply. So all of those external pressures, the antibodies that you've got, the when, the what, and the how, can all apply pressure to the supply of blood to transfusion. And we'll discuss that in this talk today. So there are some cohorts of people that are more likely to require blood. Now, these patients are transfusion dependent, and they include the patients with hemoglobinopathies, including sickle cell disorder and thalassemia. As we're all well aware, these patients, to varying degrees, require regular transfusion support of varying amounts, be it top-up or exchange transfusion. You have patients with severe aplastic anemia or myelodysplastic syndromes, and other patients with congenital or acquired chronic anemias that require transfusion support at varying stages of their lives to varying degrees. And actually finding blood for most of these patients, so the majority of people don't have antibodies. The majority of people, sourcing blood for these people, it's not a problem. However, there are a few patients that it can be an issue for. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons behind this, and there have been lots of publications, you can find loads of them online, about different cohorts of patients who become alloimmunized and who are at a greater risk of becoming alloimmunized. And that can include patients with sickle cell disorder and also patients with hematological malignancy like myelodysplastic syndrome, for instance. And obviously, even if you give the right phenotype of blood, so even if you match to Rh and K, there are variants within certain populations. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So even best laid plans don't prevent alloimmunization and don't simplify things. So if I talk particularly about sickle cell disorder as a condition where patients can become difficult to transfuse, and actually we see them quite regularly in red cell immunohaematology in our laboratories. We're quite regularly investigating these patients and cross-matching blood for these patients for these reasons. Obviously, I've described the transfusion dependency. A number of these patients are on top-up or regular exchange transfusions. They have a different red cell phenotype to the mainly Caucasian donor population. So the antigens that our donors express are different to the antigens that our patient expresses. And so therefore, when you give the donor blood to the patient is more likely to make antibodies to the donor blood because they have different antigen expression patterns. And it's already known we don't have enough donors of the same phenotype to satisfy the demand. We don't have enough Black, Asian or minority ethnic donors to satisfy the demand of our sickle cell disorder population. There's currently 12,000 people in the UK with sickle cell disorder, and I think about 300 to 400 children born every year in the UK who also have sickle cell disorder. We don't currently have enough donors that are ethnically matched who can satisfy the demand of these regular transfusions for this patient group. This patient group also have an increased chance of having variant red cell antigen expression, and many studies have shown that about 20% of the cohort of patients, so Black African, Black Afro-Caribbean patients with sickle cell disorder, have Rh gene variants. So their Rh genes are expressed differently to those in our donor population. So therefore, they'll see the donor population's Rh antigens as expressed differently, and they would therefore make antibodies to those, and that can complicate transfusion. And that also leads to the higher incidence of alloimmunization. Up to 30% of patients in this cohort are alloimmunized with either one or a number of antibodies. Now, it's the ones with a number of antibodies that I'll talk about later that can cause problems for transfusion. So in sickle cell disorder, the antibodies produced by the patients are generally the ones that are shown in this table in the different blood group systems, okay? And they can produce 1, 2, 3, 4. We've seen patients with 8, 9 antibodies, you know, so they can produce many, many antibodies at once. And it's very difficult to know, and I don't think people do know what makes people a responder. So what makes people readily make antibodies to transfusions. Some people make loads, and some people make none, and some people make one. But currently, there isn't a known gene or switch that defines who is more likely to make antibodies and who isn't. So we're really working with BSH guidelines that obviously for these patients, we match for Rh antigens and K antigens, so big C, little c, D, big E, and little e, and the K antigen. And that alone reduces the rate of alloimmunization in this chronically transfused patient cohort from 3% to 0.5% per unit. And as I've said, that's recommended in the BSH guidelines. And that's why for this cohort of patients, that antigen matching strategy is routine standard of care. Okay. So we've done the who, and we've covered briefly the main cohort of patients that we see in the who, but do remember they're not the only cohort of patients that can make antibodies to rare blood group antigens or combinations. Okay, bear that in mind. So what's the what? What is rare blood? Well, if you look at the International Society for Blood Transfusion, their definition is that rare blood is any blood that has a frequency, or any antigen that has a frequency of less than 1 in 1,000 of the general population. And now that can include people with an antibody to a high frequency or a high incidence antigen, and these are generally defined as an antigen that's present in 99% of people in the population. Okay, so only 10% of people don't express this antigen, when in fact, really, the people that you see with high frequency or high incidence antigens are also more commonly more than 99% of the population. Okay, so people who don't have this antigen are found in less than 1% of the population. So not only is it people with antibodies to high frequency or high incidence antigens, it can also be people with combinations of antibodies to common blood group antigens. And it's that combination, that specification, that extended spec, that can make blood quite difficult to source. So in all cases, we're not talking about hen's teeth when we talk about rare blood. We're not just talking about rocking horse manure or even unicorns. I mean, some of these rare donors are unicorns. Some of these patients with rare phenotypes, they are 1 in a million. They are very, very rare. Okay, and if we look at the high frequency or the high incidence antigens, where the ISBT definition is that the frequency is less than 1 in 1,000 of the population, like I just discussed before, most people express these antigens, and in many cases, more than 99% of people express the antigen, and it's your rare patient or donor that doesn't express, like the 1% that lack these antigens, that are quite hard to manage, because finding a donor that lacks that antigen is very difficult, just by definition that they are very rare. Okay, and the ISBT website has there's a committee for blood group terminology on there, and they have antigen tables on there, and I'd recommend that you go and have a look at their website. There's some amazing resources on there if you're interested in blood transfusion. And they have high incidence antigens in the 901 series that include ANWJ or Anton, ABT or LKE. Now, they're not the only ones that are high incidence antigens. There are others. And antibodies to high frequency antigens found in different blood group systems can be made following transfusion or pregnancy, and some of them are listed here. So in the RH blood group system, you have anti-RH17 or anti-RH29. In the KEL blood group system, we have anti-little k, and that's something that some of us may have encountered, patients with anti-little k. Even anti-JSB in some patient cohorts. The MNS blood group system, we have anti-U and anti-ENA. So when patients lack the M and the N antigen, they can make anti-ENA. Patients that lack FYA and FYB antigens can make anti-FY3. And patients that lack the JKA and the JKB antigens can also make anti-JK3. It's not just kind of isolated to blood group systems. You can also find different antigens to high incidence. You can find different high frequency antigens lacking in different populations as well. In the Indian populations, you have anti-IMB in the Indian blood group system. And you also have patients of the Bombay phenotype who lack the H antigen, and they can make anti-H. And anti-H is a naturally occurring antibody made by people who are of a Bombay phenotype. Okay, so again, as I said before, they're not all stimulated by transfusion, pregnancy, or transplant. Some of these antibodies, like anti-H in Bombay phenotype individuals, are naturally occurring. As I said before, anti-U and anti-JSB and anti-FY3 are more common in Black African populations, and some of these antibodies are ones in our sickle cell disorder populations, which make blood provision very difficult. And anti-JK3, so the JKA negative, B negative phenotype, is more common in the Philippines. And in the Caucasian population, you'll find that anti-KPB, anti-little k, and anti-YTA or Cartwright from the Cartwright blood group system are found within those populations. So when you're investigating these patients, it's really important to understand what their ethnic background is, what their nationality is, because that can give us a huge clue in the red cell immunohaematology lab as to what the antibody might be. Because you can't always tell from somebody's name what nationality that patient is. So it can be a really big clue finding out what nationality that patient is, particularly if their disease state isn't associated with a particular nationality, for instance, and they're just in for a routine operation. There are also null phenotypes. Now, a null phenotype is where you lack all of the antigens in a particular blood group system. And these people are really rare. Okay, so on a sliding scale of, hen's teeth, rocking horse manure, and unicorns, to use a poor analogy, I'd say, these people are the unicorns of the stable. So, Rh null individuals are extremely rare. There aren't that many identified. And if you want to read an article about Rh null individuals, there's an article called "The Man with the Golden Blood," and that describes a donor in another country who is an Rh null individual. And if you are an Rh null individual, you can make an antibody to total Rh, to all of the Rh antigens, which pretty much makes you untransfusable. It's clinically significant, and you need Rh null blood if you need blood for an operation. Again, in the KEL blood group system, the null phenotype is K0. In the MNS blood group system, people that lack M, N, big S, and little s antigens are MK phenotype. And as I said before, people who lack the H antigen are Bombay phenotype, and that's more common, as I've said, in Indian populations. I think it's 1 in 9,600 people in certain regions within India, and they have naturally occurring anti-H. And as I said, most null phenotypes are really rare, but being a null phenotype, they do have the potential to make an antibody to the high frequency antigen that they lack. And that's why if you have a patient who's a null phenotype, finding compatible blood, if they've got that corresponding antibody, can be very difficult. And the antibodies to these high frequency antigens look like this. They're pan-reactive, so they're reacting with all the cells that you have in your blood bank, with all the reagents that you have at your disposal, and the autologous control, the auto control on the right there, is negative because they obviously lack that antigen, so that antibody that they have isn't going to react with their own cells, but it's going to react with everybody else, all of your reagents, okay? So this pan-reactivity could be an issue. It's not just an issue for finding blood, but actually there could be other antibodies underneath this reactivity, underneath the antibody to a high frequency antigen, okay? So where did we do those investigations? Well, initially, if you have a patient who you suspect to have an antibody to a high frequency or high incidence antigen, you'd refer the sample to your local red cell immunohaematology lab, and they would perform an investigation and try and identify what specificity that antibody is. And that's where they would, use the clues like reactivity, the strength of reactivity, the technique it's reacting with. Is it affected by any modification with enzymes or chemicals? What is the nationality of that patient? There's lots of things that people can take into account to kind of identify what that antibody is. And if we're unable to identify what that antibody is, or we identify it and we want to confirm what that antibody is in our RCI laboratories, we have the experts at the International Blood Group Reference Laboratory, also based in Bristol, and that's a world-leading laboratory for the investigation of antibodies to high incidence antigens. And they have a huge range of rare cells and rare antisera at their disposal, as well as, most importantly, expertise in the identification and the investigation of patients with antibodies to high incidence antigens or mixtures of antibodies. And that's most important. You can have the tools at your disposal, but you need to be aware of how to investigate them. And you really must be familiar with these types of cases, because the knowledge of what antibodies are more present in certain populations, and what they look like, how they react, and their optimum reaction patterns, or their personalities, as it always is. There's many antibodies, they almost have personalities, how they react. That's really important for a serologist to know. So for these people working at IBGRL, they really are experts in antibody identification, as well as my colleagues within the RCI laboratories. So continuing with the what, we talked about antibodies to high frequency or high incidence antigens. What about those with mixtures of antibodies, as I've alluded to before? You've got people who've got antibodies to a number of red cell antigens, and they can be really difficult to match for, depending on what antibodies they've got and the number of antibodies that they've got, and then what frequency of the antigens are like in the donor population. Another important thing to consider is actually, is that antibody clinically significant? If they've got 3 antibodies, do we need to match for all 3? Or is one of them not clinically significant, and we can say, well, we don't need to provide antigen negative blood for that antibody because it doesn't cause hemolytic transfusion reaction? And again, when do you need the blood? What's the urgency of the request? Do we have time to source blood? And I'll come on to sourcing blood next, the where. Okay, but we're focusing on the what at the moment. Okay. So antibody mixtures could be a number of things. Antibody mixtures that make it hard to find blood generally can be anti-little s and another antibody. So the frequency of the little s antigen in the population is of people lacking the little s antigen in the population is very low, and therefore finding little s negative blood that is also negative for another antibody, say another antigen, for instance, little e, can be very difficult. So again, R2 blood plus another antibody, that can be quite hard to find. If it's a pediatric patient and we need an IUT or a top-up, and we need R2 plus another antibody, it can get difficult. Even D negative blood plus another antibody in certain populations. If you have a patient with an anti-FY3 who has sickle cell disorder and an anti-D, well, we need to find D negative, FYA negative, B negative blood. And that is very rare. It's not common to find. There are other antibodies like anti-DOA or DOB, which are antibodies to Dombrok blood group system antigens, or anti-JSA, which is an antigen in the KEL blood group system. Well, even though those antigens in themselves are not present in populations to a massive degree, and we can find antigen negative blood in theory, or compatible blood in theory, it's quite difficult because we don't routinely type our donors for these antigens. So we don't have a huge supply of DOA negative donors or DOB negative donors or typed JSA negative donors, because the reagents that we have for typing our donors, we don't have like specific anti-DOA or specific anti-DOB or specific anti-JSA, just because single specificity reagents of those types are extremely rare, extremely hard to come by. And I said about antibodies having personalities, you'll often find anti-DOA and anti-DOB in mixtures of antibodies. So you'll find it, you'll have a patient with 4 or 5 antibodies and an anti-DOB, okay? And I always think, well, it's like a social antibody. It likes to party, it likes to hang around with lots of other antibodies. But again, that's a serologist perspective. That's the characteristics of different antibodies. Okay. So let's look at some examples. So we have a patient who is an R1R1, big K neg, M neg, big S neg, JKA neg, FYA neg. It's easy to match if we had to find blood that matched this type. Well, 20% of people are R1R1, 18% are R1R1 K neg, 9% are R1R1 K neg, big S neg, 2.2% are R1R1 K neg, big S neg, JKA neg, and 0.7% of our donor population lack all of those antigens. Okay. Sorry, my screen's just gone blank. There we go. And that's a frequency of 1 in 143. Okay. So 1 in 143 of our donors will have that phenotype. And if you need 10 units of that phenotype, we'd have to find 1,430 donors, okay? Which isn't insignificant. What about this example? An R2-R2. As I mentioned before, R2-R2 being slightly more difficult to find. What if we had to find this combination? Well, only 2% of the population are R2-R2. 1.8% of the population are R2-R2 K-neg. 0.18% of the population are R2-R2 K-neg, little s-neg. So even fewer don't express little s antigen. 0.042%, you can see we're getting to the really small figures now, and 0.014%, or 1 in 7,143 donors lack all of these antigens. Okay, so you can see where I'm coming from when I talk about combinations of antibodies also making blood difficult to find. And I think it's really important if you have patients who have, for instance, sickle cell disorder. You had a patient with sickle cell disorder who had this phenotype and they didn't have any antibodies. Well, the routine standard of care would be to match for RH and K. So yes, you'd be matching for you'd be looking for R2-R2 big K neg, and that would be quite difficult to find. But if they didn't have any antibodies and you said, well, I'm going to match for little s, JKB and FYB as well, you can imagine how difficult that is. And then if you manage to get hold of some of those units, there's also the risk that you're taking those units away from people that might have this combination of antibodies. Okay, so then you're matching, you're providing extended match blood, which is a rare resource in this instance for people who don't necessarily need it. So you must bear that in mind when ordering blood from OBOS. Okay, that you only need to match for the antibodies that the patient has. Okay. What about this example? So RO, okay, 2% of our donor population. Now, this is a Caucasian donor population, so this will be, or the UK donor population, which is made up of a variety of nationalities, but it is mainly a Caucasian donor population. And again, 1.8% lacking big K, 0.8% lacking big S, as well as being RO, 0.2% being JKB neg. And if you want a Caucasian FYA neg, B neg, JKB neg, big S neg, K neg, RO, then that really is impossible. That's 1 in 50,000 people. I mean, that is very, very rare. Okay, Caucasian, very rare that the FYA negative, B negative phenotype is found in Caucasian population. Okay, but actually this phenotype is quite common in Black African populations, particularly our patients with sickle cell disorder. So you can see, actually, if we're supporting a population of patients of a different nationality to the majority of our donors, we really do need to increase the recruitment of our donors. And if we had ethnically matched donors with that phenotype, well, 23% are RO, 22% are RO K neg, 15% are RO K neg big S neg, 7% are RO K neg big S neg JKB neg, and 5% match that phenotype. So that's 1 in 19, okay, of an ethnically matched donor population. So if we had a donor population who majority were of Black African heritage, then we'd find it easier to find blood. But you have to remember that not many of our donors, of our entire donor population, are of Black African heritage, and there are recruitment drives constantly for donors of that particular phenotype. In fact, the majority of our donors that are RO are white Caucasian, which is surprising given the frequency of RO within the white Caucasian population compared to that in the African population. So the extended genotypes of our donors don't match the minority groups that are requiring transfusion. And a lot of these, as I've mentioned, require transfusions on a regular basis. And then that obviously leads to a supply and demand problem. We can't supply RO blood to all of these patients that match the full extended phenotype, particularly if they've got antibodies. So we tend to use little r units as substitutions, and that then pulls from the little r supply, which of course is used for neonates, emergency transfusions, and many other uses as well. So again, that leads to another problem. It compounds the effect of shortage of donors in other areas, okay? And that's why it's really important to emphasize and to advertise for a wide variety of donors that reflect our patient population and our population in the UK as well. So that's the what. What about the where? Okay, so we've done the who, the what. Let's finally talk about the where. So where do we get rare blood from? Well, there's a number of sources of rare blood, and we normally search for them in a specific order. Okay, we don't go far and wide first. We look closest to home first. Okay, and whether where we look first actually depends on the number of units that people want, how quickly they want it, and also what specification. How likely are we going to be to get those units looking close to home? Actually, is it better that we start looking further afield first because of the rarity? So the sources of rare blood that we look for generally include the following, and we look in this order in 99% of cases with most antibodies that we encounter. First, we check our fresh stock. If it's not in fresh stock, we'll call in donors who we know to have that rare type, either lacking an antigen to a high frequency antibody, or they lack the certain combinations of antigens that we're interested in for this patient because this patient has that combination of antibodies. We also have some stock in Liverpool, our national frozen blood bank. Finally, we have the international rare donor panel. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these in turn. So first of all, looking whether there are any wet units available in NHSBT's general stock. And that's just a search of all our current stock within all of NHSBT's sites, in our manufacturing centres and also in our stock holding units. And this is the first place that we look for, because if there are any wet units, and normally we look for units and we find units that are, say, little k negative, or units that have certain combinations of antigens that are antigen negative. So you need an RO, FYA negative, B negative, JKB negative unit. You could search wet stocks first, because looking closer to home, it's more likely that you'll find some units nationally that fit the specification that you need. But sometimes they're at various places throughout the country. So the logistics then of getting those to one place to be cross-matched with the patient's plasma in a regional RCI laboratory and then issued to the hospital can be quite complicated. And that does require some planning and close liaison between NHSBT, the hospital services departments, the hospital transfusion lab, the clinicians looking after the patients. So it really is a multidisciplinary team approach and requires planning. I see a question, what is a wet unit? A wet unit is a fresh unit. Okay, so I've given blood, it's been processed into platelets, red cells and plasma. The red cells have got SAG-M in them and they're sitting in our stock nationally. They haven't been frozen, they're just in our stock rooms. It's a wet unit, it's a fresh unit. Okay, it's a good question. Thank you. So what if we don't have any fresh units or wet units available in our national stock? Well, we'll call in rare donors. We have a list of donors who have particular antigen combinations or lack specific high incidence antigens, and we'll contact them, get in touch, and call them in to donate. And sorry, can someone just mute their mic? Make sure. Okay, thank you. So we'll call in donors. Okay, and calling in these donors is only really an option if there's time. Okay, so if it's a planned operation or a scheduled transfusion, actually arranging for donors to come in and giving blood, obviously it requires planning. Additionally, we have to make sure that the donors are fit to donate. We can't harm our donors. Our donors and our patients are really important to us. And NHSBT, we're really focused on donor health and also our patient health as well. We're unique in that we have donors and patients that we serve. Okay, and it's actually got to be safe for the donor to donate. And often, if we need 1 unit of blood, we have to call in 2 donors because of a number of reasons. There could be a number of factors that mean that donation is unable to be taken. And that can include any one of these. And the donor doesn't attend. People have lives, people have priorities, people forget. You know, the donor may not attend the appointment. Actually, they've got a recent medical history of illness or vaccination, you know, more recently, that excludes them from donation for a period of time. Or they don't pass the fitness to donate hemoglobin threshold tests. Or they've been traveling, you know, people like to go on holiday, but they like to visit family. A lot of these donors, you know, have family in, you know, in countries in Africa, and obviously, you know, travel to go and see relatives, and therefore there are periods, you know, when they come back where they're excluded from donation. So it can be quite difficult. And in very rare cases, we might get a donor as a member of the patient's family who also shares that rare type through genetic inheritance, and they're compatible with the patient. So a sibling, for instance. Okay. Sometimes we do autologous donation, but that is really in very, very rare cases. It really would be for individuals who have extremely rare phenotypes. One example would be if you were Rh null, you know, you would donate some blood, and because you are that person, you know, you're likely to be the only person with that phenotype. That blood would probably be used for you, but we don't promise that that blood is only used for one patient. So if I'm an Rh null, I would give a unit of blood just if I'm able to. First of all, if I'm healthy and able to give a unit of blood, I could give a unit of blood to be frozen at the NFBB, the National Frozen Blood Bank. But actually, there's no guarantee that that blood would be kept for me because somebody else could need it before me. It's very rare because my type of blood is extremely rare that it would be used for somebody other than me, but that's the altruistic donation process. So what about the National Frozen Blood Bank? Well, we have a National Frozen Blood Bank based in Liverpool, and that's got small stocks of frozen rare blood, again, of specific types, either specific null phenotypes or antigen mixtures combined with null phenotypes that can be thawed on request for certain patients with those antibodies, and that is really only used if we can't find blood from the first 2 sources. Okay. However, there is a delay in that. It's not an instantaneous process. You know, again, it requires planning and communication. Okay, we need to understand how much, we need to understand when, and we need to understand where. With every unit of blood that we thaw, with 1 unit, there's a 6 to 8 hour processing time. And with additional units, there's 4 to 6 hours. So a 2-unit request could take 8 to 10 hours to thaw and process. And then on top of that, you've got the logistical travel time from Liverpool to wherever you are in the country, and the cross-matching in the regional RCI lab if you want that to be undertaken there. So all of that has to be factored in to the request. And you can see from that actually urgent requests to the National Frozen Blood Bank, it's not really suitable for urgent requests. Okay. And also, frozen units might not always be a viable option because frozen units don't have a 35-day shelf life. They have a 72-hour shelf life. So it might be that the patient doesn't attend or something happens and then the unit expires. So you really do have to plan for transfusion for these patients and understand that the thawed units have a much shorter shelf life. Sorry. Because of the small stocks that they have at the frozen blood bank as well, they wouldn't typically be able to fulfill a large order because that would deplete our stocks too quickly. Obviously, by its very nature, the blood is rare, therefore we don't have huge amounts, okay? And therefore, large orders are normally sustained by, as I've discussed, planning with the clinicians and calling in rare donors. What about the last option, the International Rare Donor Panel? Well, the International Rare Donor Panel is maintained by the International Blood Group Reference Laboratory, and it consists of donors from 27 countries worldwide, and they all have rare phenotypes. And IBGRL will compile that list and compile and maintain that website, and they keep up-to-date data on people who contribute to it, the donors on it, and also key contacts at those different blood services if there are requests that can't be fulfilled by either finding stuff in our stock or calling in donors or from the National Frozen Blood Bank. And this again is for very rare instances. Okay. But again, logistically, sourcing units from the International Rare Donor Panel can be very challenging. And there's a lot of obstacles to overcome, particularly around the logistics. And it's not suited to urgent requests for transfusion because of the time taken. And there are some things that need to be considered in addition to storing units from the National Frozen Blood Bank. For instance, the availability of courier companies with the capacity to handle temperature-controlled products. Is the packaging correct to ensure temperature lasts the distance required? Because you've got this geographical distance that units have to travel, especially if they've been thawed or if they're going to be kept on ice. You have cancellations of flights. We've got no control over that. If a flight gets cancelled and there's a delay, we have no control. There are different regulations between countries, there's import and export duties and charges, and there's different rules on donation, on testing, depending on the country. There's even different sizes of standard blood banks. Because obviously people in Japan are much more petite than people in the Western hemisphere, and therefore their standard units of blood are much smaller than our standard units of blood in the Western world. And you can get some significant delays, so it doesn't always go smoothly. But the teams work extremely hard and have had some really successful outcomes. One of which is on the NHSBT website, and this was publicised a couple of years ago, I think, on social media. And there was a patient who had an anti-IMB, and had a condition where she required transfusion of IMB negative blood. That anti-IMB was clinically significant and could cause hemolytic transfusion reactions. So the Americans reached out to the International Blood Group Reference Laboratory team, who searched the Rare Donor Panel and found a matching donor on the UK's own donor panel. So the team at NHSBT Blood and Transplant, Rebecca Land and Emma Watkins, fantastic team in Birmingham, reached out, contacted the donor to come in and donate a unit, and that unit was tested by Tooting site and supplied in liquid form to the United States. So, a fantastic outcome for this patient in finding rare blood. So, learning points to take away from this presentation is that people with rare blood groups and corresponding antibodies are difficult to transfuse. That's quite an obvious statement, but I think it's a really important learning point, because once you understand that they are difficult to transfuse, you can kind of appreciate some of the things that you need to do in order to transfuse them. And the most essential thing you need to do is to plan. And that would include a plan A. What do you need? Where do you need it? And when? Okay. And it's that collaboration and that communication between the hospital transfusion laboratory, the clinician looking after the patient, the surgical team, the hematologists, and the red cell immunohaematology laboratories, and or IBGRL, depending on the antibody, that really is key in managing these patients. Okay. More importantly, a plan B. What do we do if the patient needs blood urgently? What is the urgent? What is our plan B? SHOT have obviously issued a message saying that obviously delays in transfusion are significant and then cause harm to patients. What is our plan B? That's a really important thing to consider for all of our patients. If things aren't going to plan and the patient needs transfusion urgently, what are we going to give them? The worst thing is to have decision paralysis when you have a patient who has a rare antibody and we don't transfuse. No patient should die through lack of blood. We should always have a plan B in place. Okay. And as I've mentioned, teamwork, timescales, and communication are key. And that's very much like routine NHS work. When we work, we collaborate. We work together as a team in the NHS to achieve the best outcomes for our patient. And it's no different to working with NHSBT to supply blood for our patients, to ensure that we've got the right blood for the right patient at the right time. And by having the right blood, we need to make sure that all of the effort that we put in to supplying that right blood isn't wasted. It's wasting rare blood it breaks my heart. All of the effort, we identify donors, the donors come in, all of the logistics and the planning involved, and we'll send the units to the hospital and they're never used. It's great that they're not used, but wasting it when it's not required is something else as well, because sometimes we would receive a request for 4 units of rare blood when in fact 2 may do, and it's that conversation between clinicians and the blood service. And again, patient blood management has played a huge role in mitigating against the wastage of blood. But that's another topic that I would imagine has been or will be covered in these meetings. If in doubt, contact the RCI lab. We are here to help. Okay, we're always ready to talk about patients and work on patients with complicated transfusion requirements. And that ends my presentation today. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd like to thank Danny and Selma and Nasir for inviting me to speak. I've really enjoyed it. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer questions. I see there's a couple in the comments, but thank you. Thank you once again.
Awesome, thank you very much, Tom. A really interesting talk, and you're quite right. There is quite a few questions which I've marked in the chat box. So I will start with the top. What advice can you give regarding dealing with rare antibodies which do not have screening cells with the required antigens to detect them?
So if you have rare antibodies which don't have screening cells with the required antigens, yeah, I mean, by their very definition, you're not going to be able to make a reagent or screening cells. You're not going to be able to find a donor to supply you that reagent. And that's why we have reference centres. So if you're based in the UK, we have the red cell immunohaematology reference centres, and you would refer to them, and they have some reagents available that will allow them to work on and identify patients with these rare combinations of antibodies or rare antibodies. The problem is, if we, because of the rarity and the number of people that lack either the antigen or the combination of antigens, we're unable as a service to give everybody rare reagents. And as I've said, it's really important to build up expertise in the identification of these antibodies, because they all react with different reaction strengths. You need to use different enzymes like trypsin, alpha chymotrypsin, pronase, AET, DTT. There's a huge wealth of reagents that you can use and methodologies that you can use, as well as expertise, and that's really important to identify these. So I would say, if you suspect you have an antibody to a high frequency antigen, refer to your reference centre for identification.
Brilliant, cheers, Tom. How many units are stored in the frozen blood bank? How long can they be stored for?
Oh, off the top of my head, I don't know. I would have to check how many units are stored in the frozen blood bank. They can be stored, I think, for about 10 years, but depending on the rarity, if we've got some really rare units in there, then they would be stored for much longer. It depends on obviously how rare that blood is and how likely it is that we'll find another donor with that particular rarity, for instance. So yeah, I mean, it can be variable, but I think the standard is 10.
Brilliant. If rare blood cannot be sourced and antigen positive blood is transfused, do you provide most compatible, and how is that decision made? And the question goes on to say, also, there are any testing performed to identify this, or are patients just monitored for transfusion reactions? Yeah,
so if you have to supply antigen positive blood, there is on the NHSBT clinical guidelines website, on the Hospitals and Sciences website of NHSBT, there is a document called SPN 214, the clinical certificates of antibodies of blood group antigens and the supply of blood for transfusion. And that lists all different blood groups, lots of different antigens and lots of different antibodies and their clinical significance. But you'll also find a document on there that describes what blood to select if compatibility can't be assured. And normally we would either drop the age of the unit. So if it was for a patient with sickle cell disorder, we would say, okay, let's not worry about the units being 7 or 10 days old. Let's look at the antibodies that patient has. Okay, let's drop an anti-M because it's not reacting at 37 degrees. Let's not worry about the anti-M. Let's not worry about the anti-N for November because they're rarely clinically significant. Let's not worry about the little e because the patient is little e positive and it's an autoantibody. So there are certain things that we drop in order to fulfill that specification. And then we would, if we're issuing incompatible units and there is an antibody there that has the potential to be clinically significant, we'd recommend transfusing with pre-medication. Consider giving IVIG and steroids to support that transfusion and monitor the patient for any signs of acute or delayed hemolysis following that transfusion. But there isn't a standard form that we have to kind of report about the outcomes of those incompatible transfusions, but it is a piece of work that we are looking into at the moment.
Cheers, Tom. A potentially difficult question. Considering the rarity of frozen blood units and sometimes the delays caused by transportation, would you be able to extend the shelf life beyond 72 hours?
I think that work's been done looking at extending that shelf life of frozen blood beyond 72 hours, and then you kind of get into the realms of actually, is it a therapeutically beneficial product to give somebody something that won't give them the therapeutic effect of a fresh unit? So are you doing more harm than good? Is it actually worth giving them that blood if it's not going to benefit them? So I think that validation's been undertaken looking at the effect of frozen blood being used beyond 72 hours. I'm not aware that we would breach that time limit. I mean, if it was like 1 of 1, maybe, but yeah, it's not something that's done routinely.
Thank you, Tom. A question here, does the UK utilise MMA to assess how patients would fare with antigen positive blood when antigen negative blood is not available?
Do we utilise, say again, MMA?
MMA, yeah. Perhaps
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, Julia, do you want to come in and ask that question? Have you got access to your microphone?
Oh, sorry, the monospecific monolayer, the monolayer assay. No, we don't. Sorry,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Monocyte monolayer assay, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
sorry.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. That's a really good question. No, we don't have the monocyte monolayer assay. It's something that was done previously, also under the guise of chemiluminescence testing, and the clinical utility of it and the frequency that we would do it wasn't considered significant enough to warrant carrying on that test. A lot of the antibodies, obviously there's not that much data on the outcomes of transfusion, so we're looking at collecting that data, but whether it's correlated well enough with the MMA result, I don't think so. It's not something that we offer.
Thank you. I think I've got through the questions that have been posted into the chat box. We do probably have still 2 to 3 minutes, so if anybody wants to come in with another question, feel free to raise your hand and use your microphone, and we'll use this last couple of minutes. But if not, we can potentially bring the meeting to a close.
Okay, that's great. If anyone's got any feedback, please do fill those feedback forms out. I'm happy to hear critics. I'm happy to hear positive and negative feedback because it helps us all improve. So thank you so much once again for inviting me today.